Today, we are continuing our month of September. We are continuing the trait of success of a growing faith. And if you haven't been here the last couple weeks, this year we are going through 12 different traits that will lead to success, both spiritually and personally, in your life if you would learn to implement them into your life. So we are taking a month at a time, talking about those things and talking about how you can grow in those traits, how you can implement them and make them a part of your life to achieve success. Now, my question real quick is, those of you who have been here for the last 2 weeks, how many of you have been focusing during the week on the trait of a growing faith with the scriptures? Okay, that's what I thought. So let me do this next part because I had an optional part in this morning's message, and I'm going to do it here because the option means I have to tell you. So here we go. What I want you to know is this. Spiritual growth will not happen through doing life strictly through the things of this church building. Okay? If all you are doing is your faith when you are here at this church building, you will not grow spiritually. Growing spiritually, becoming the person that God desires for you to be, finding eternal purpose in your life, and finding contentment, peace, and joy of walking with Jesus Christ will only happen when you start to embrace the pursuit of your relationship with Christ outside of the walls of this church building. Okay? I want you to be clear on that. If you only focus on your growing while you are at this building, all you will ever gain is religion, but you will fail to encounter the living God on a regular basis in your life. At the same time, if you only focus on growing when you are away from this building, because some people go, I only have to go to church every once in a while and I can do it on my own because God's everywhere, which is all true. But if you're only focusing on growing in your faith when you're away from this building, what happens is you start to become self-absorbed. And what happens is you miss out on the kingdom work that God is doing around this world and the big picture things that he is up to, and you miss out on those. So let me just encourage you, please use the tools that we provide you to start a daily walk with God, a daily devotional time with God. You have those cards we've been handing out each month. Those will change to help you do a better job of just having a devotional time with God each day. It doesn't have to be real long. It can be whatever fits your schedule and where you're at spiritually, but it gives you some scriptures to focus on for that month. I just talked about growing spiritually and how important that is because that's the first trait we're looking at, all right? So as a personal plea from your minister to you, I don't do this too often. I want to encourage you, implement your spiritual growth, implement a time with God during the week, not just when you're here at this church building, all right? Does everyone got that? Got to make a commitment. The first week we talked about the things that get in our way, and some of those things were like, apathy, we just don't have time, too busy, things like that. I can't tell you and I can't express how important it is for you to build your relationship with God outside of what happens in this church building. All right, moving on. Today, we're going to look at a person in the Bible today we rarely look at, and the reason we rarely look at him is there's really nothing positive we can learn from his life story. He is a perfect example of a guy who failed to grow spiritually even though he had every opportunity, almost the perfect opportunity, to actually grow, yet he failed. And the reason we're going to look at him this morning is this. Sometimes we can learn some of the best lessons in our life by looking at other people's failure. Have you ever done that? Seen someone else fail and it taught you a lesson so you didn't fail the same way? Have you learned lessons that way? Okay, let me give you some examples we have seen in society. Here's some different people. First one, who's that? Tiger Woods, okay? What we can learn from Tiger Woods is this. If you have a wife, focus only on her. Okay? That's the lesson to learn from that. If you have a wife, focus only on her. It cost Tiger Woods, what year was that? 2009, $750 million in his divorce. $750 million. I couldn't afford $750 a divorce without him. That's an insurmountable amount, so I'm just going to focus on her. So that's the lesson we learned. If you have a wife, focus on her. She is your focus. God gave her to you to focus on her. Here's another one, the picture, the Titanic. All right, everybody know the story of the Titanic? Okay, the lesson we learned from the Titanic is this. Arrogance can make you blind. All right, that's the lesson you should learn from the Titanic, because they said it was the unsinkable ship, and the first time it goes out, it sinks. All right? Arrogance can blind you to different things in your life that you need to be aware of. The next one, how many of you know who this guy is? Jeez almighty, you people, you guys need to watch more NFL. That's all I'm saying, okay? That is Ray Rice. Yes, thank you, Carrie. That is Ray Rice. So Ray Rice, if you remember him, 2014, the lesson you learn from him is this. You never lay a hand on your wife. You don't hit your girlfriend. You don't hit a female. You don't lay your hands on a woman, all right? If you do, your career's over and everything else in your life is over. He's the guy that they videotaped in the elevator who actually hauled off and just hit his wife, and they had it on video, and his career was over. The guy's been destroyed, all right? So that's the lesson we learned from Ray Rice. Next lesson, the Space Shuttle Challenger, 1986. How many of you remember that one or old enough to remember that? Quite a few of you, okay. That one exploded, and the lesson you learn from that is every detail matters. What they found out, the thing that imploded the Challenger, was it was an O seal, which is one of those little rubber rings that was about the size of your thumb. That was the width of it. That one thing in the entire space shuttle caused it to blow to pieces because it had some cracks in it. And they weren't paying attention to details, and they just left it on there, and it ended up blowing the whole thing to pieces. Next one. Does anyone know this one? Younger generation should. Good. Stephen, youth minister, knows. Who? What? Oh, the Amanda Show. Okay, yeah, there you go. Okay, Amanda Bynes. I never saw that show, but thank you, Jill. Okay, the Amanda Bynes, she was Nickelodeon's, one of Nickelodeon stars. And what ended up happening to her, if you know anything about her, her life is just a total disastrous mess and has been depressed for like the last 8 years due to drug use. And so the lesson you learn with Amanda Bynes is this. Don't do drugs because it will mess you up, okay? That's what you need to learn from Amanda. Don't do drugs. It will mess you up. And she's been messed up ever since. The last one, the Mars Orbiter. This one was from 1999. The lesson we learned here is communication matters when you're working with other people. Communication is key. Funniest story in the world. The satellite cost $240 million. The groups of scientists they had, one group was working with English standard measurements, and the other was working with metric. And so they were building this thing together. One group was working with metric, one was working with English standard measurements, and they built it together, and when they sent it into space, the two didn't compute together, and they couldn't communicate with it, and it just drifted off into no man's land somewhere. And it's gone, and $250 million up and gone. And people found out what happened. They went, how did you guys not talk about you're using metric and you're using English measurements? And no one could explain it. And they worked together for a year and a half, making that satellite $240 million gone into space because they didn't communicate about how they were measuring things. Today, we're going to look at a biblical and a spiritual failure. His name is Judas, and we're going to learn some valuable lessons from him. He was a man, as I said, that had every opportunity to succeed and change the world. Yet he ended up a complete failure because he failed to grow. And when you look at his life, that was the core element. He failed to grow. So today we're going to examine his failures in his life and why he failed to grow. Now, let me give you a little background. If you don't know a lot about Judas, here's who Judas is. Judas is a guy, he was one of Jesus' 12 disciples. So like the other 12 disciples, he is someone that Jesus handpicked, actually went to and grabbed, and some of them we know he went up to and basically said, I'll show you how to fish for men. Come follow me. And they were like, okay, we'll go change the world with you. Same thing had to have happened to Judas. Judas leaves his stuff and starts to follow Jesus, and he follows him for the full 3 years. What that means is this. Judas is a guy that heard all of Jesus' teachings. Not just the ones we read in the scripture. He heard all of Jesus' teachings. He saw all of Jesus' miracles. So he saw all the supernatural things, all the healings, all the different things Jesus did. He had first-hand sight. He was right there in the moment seeing those things happen. He knew Jesus' heart. He spent 3 years with him and saw this man's heart and knew who he was. And he got to interact with Jesus on a daily basis for 3 years. So he spent a great deal of his life for 3 years following this guy day in, day out, seeing all the things he was doing, teaching, all the miracles he was performing. That's who Judas was. That was the environment he lived in for 3 years. Yet his story ends up one of horrible failure. Horrible failure. He never grows spiritually during that 3 years. Another thing we see is he ends up being the guy who betrays and sells out Jesus. Let me just read to you a scripture from Matthew 26. It tells you this. It says, then Judas Iscariot, one of the 12 disciples, went to the leading priest and asked, how much will you pay me to betray Jesus to you? and they gave him 30 pieces of silver. From that time on, Judas began looking for an opportunity to betray Jesus. So one of his 12 hand-picked guys who spent 3 years with him is the guy who goes, I'll betray him. Just tell me what I need to do. Pay me some money. I'll betray him. So he's a guy who ends up selling him out and betraying Jesus personally. Eventually, he commits suicide. That's the end of his story, is he commits suicide. If you go to Matthew chapter 27, it says this about him. It says, when Judas, who had betrayed him, realized that Jesus had been condemned to die, he was filled with remorse. So he took the 30 pieces of silver back to the leading priests and the elders. He says, I have sinned, he declared, for I betrayed an innocent man. And they said this, they said, what do we care? They retorted. That's your problem. Then Judas threw the silver coins down in the temple, and he went out and he hanged himself. That's the story of Judas. Is that a happy one? Woo-hoo, good thing you came to church today, okay? That is Judas, a man who spent 3 years with Jesus, seeing all those things, and he sells him out, and then when he realizes he's going to be killed after selling him out, he basically goes and hangs himself. And he gives back his money and just goes, I messed up, and he hangs himself. That's the end of his story. So what I want to do is this. I want to examine why did he end up being a failure? How could this guy be in a perfect environment to grow spiritually and utterly fail? Utterly fail and just sink. How did that happen? And as I was going through his account, there's 3 things that I started to notice this week that I went, it seems like these are the 3 things that stopped him from growing spiritually, that led him to being a failure in his life. And as I looked at them, I started to go, I see these things in our world as well. These are 3 mindsets, 3 barriers that get in the way of people growing spiritually as well. So we're going to look at them, and there's 3 of them. The first one is this. The first reason I think Judas ended up a failure was this doubt. First big thing was doubt. He was a guy I don't think ever really bought into Jesus being the Son of God. He just never really bought into it. He was the guy who wears the name Christian and says, I'm a Christian, but never fully convinced that Jesus is who he says he is, that Jesus really is the Son of God, that Jesus really is our Savior, that basically maybe even Judas said this, he's a good teacher, he's a good rabbi, he's a good guy, he's building like this little separate teaching group and this little like following, but never really bought into that he was the Son of God. And I still see this a lot in Christians today, is a lot of people that go to church, a lot of people who wear the title of Christ on their life and say, I'm a Christian, that have never really fully bought in that Jesus Christ is the Son of God. That he's God himself that came to live on this earth to pay the penalty of our sins, and just go, I don't really buy it, but I do the church thing. I'm here. I like it. It's a good community. It's got some good things. It teaches my kids some good things. It's a nice place for me to be. I learn some things. I grow. But I don't really know if I believe he was the Son of God. Okay? That was Judas. If you go to John chapter 6, 64, it says this, but some of you do not believe. What had happened here is Jesus had a rough teaching. A lot of the disciples flee him at this point, not the 12, but a lot of other people that were following around him. He gives us teaching. These people go, I don't like that, and they take off. And he says, but some of you do not believe. For Jesus knew from the beginning which ones didn't believe, and he knew who would betray him. So Jesus already even felt in Judas, you're not buying into this thing. You don't fully believe who I say I am. You might think I'm a good guy. You might think I'm a good teacher. But you don't believe I'm the Son of God. And so Judas's doubt became a huge hindrance in his life to growing spiritually. That brings us to the second thing that I think caused Judas to be an absolute failure, and that is this, greed. Okay? Judas wanted to be rich in this world. Judas wanted to make a decent living in this world. He wanted to have decent things around him, and his focus was very much on how do I get stuff for me rather than how do I worry about the things of the kingdom of God. You notice this passage in John chapter 12, verses 4 through 6. What happens is Jesus comes into this house. It's 6 days before he's going to be betrayed and crucified. Okay? And a good friend of his named Mary, when he enters the house, comes over, and instead of cleaning his feet with water, she actually takes a 12-ounce, which would be the size of a can of Coke or whatever, 12-ounce jar of perfume that it says is highly expensive. So some type of rare perfume, very expensive at the time. She breaks it, and she anoints his feet, basically pours it on his feet, and it says she actually wipes it off and cleans his feet with her hair. Okay? Now you look at that and go, what in the world? Here's what it was showing. is just an immense respect she had for him. That she was willing to give up an incredibly expensive perfume, and she was willing to serve him, not to go grab a towel, I'm going to use my own hair to clean your feet, which was the ultimate act of a servant. So she was proclaiming her servanthood to him and humbling herself before Christ. And what happens in that moment, that all happens, should have been a beautiful thing. What happens, it says this, but Judas Iscariot, the disciple whom would soon betray him, said, that perfume was worth a year's wages. It should have been sold and the money given to the poor. Not that he cared for the poor, he was a thief. And since he was in charge of the disciples' money, he often stole some for himself. So what we see with Judas is this. Some way he had worked himself into being the treasurer of the group, any money that they had, and he was stealing it for himself out of the side. So he sees not an incredible act of servanthood and humbleness. He sees a woman throwing money away and goes, man, she could have sold that. We could have got a lot of money, and I could have dipped into that money, and I could have got myself a nice new cell phone. Okay? That's what he was thinking. He was going, I have the iPhone 4. Dude, if she would just sell that, we could get that. I could steal out 1,000 out of that, and I could go get myself the iPhone 8 that just got released. That's what he was thinking. That is Judas' mindset. He was greedy. His mind was on, how do I live in comfort here? How do I get the things I want to get? How do I benefit myself? Even in the midst of spending time with Jesus, it was all about Judas and how I can get my hands on money, how I can attain wealth. And that became a huge factor in his life that I think made it almost impossible for him to grow spiritually. I swear to you, I muted this thing earlier, so there's a, hey, your phone's ringing, ringtone of mine. All right, so with that saying, looking at our own lives, to take this into our own perspective, our own picture, how many of us are greedy? How often does the pursuit of wealth get in the way of our pursuit of God? How often do we look at money being given over there and go, man, I could take it from there and I could use it here and I could get myself something nice? How often do we look and go, I give some money to God's kingdom work, but you know what? If I didn't give it there, I could get some new tires on my car, and my car needs some new tires. Right? How often do we go, I could do work for God, but I could go over here and do some work to get paid, and I'm going to go over there and get paid, and somebody else can do the work of the kingdom. Judas sounds awful. Is he a whole lot different than the struggles that we have? I look at him and I can relate to him some and go, I know the pull of wealth. I know the pull of greed. I know the pull of wanting to have nice things and going, I'm not willing to sacrifice it so I can get what I want, and God can figure out his stuff on his own. God can work through other people. He doesn't need to work through me. I need to get my stuff. Judas is a greedy man, and it becomes a huge hindrance in his ability to grow spiritually, which leads to the third reason I think Judas was an utter failure. And it's just this, personal ambition. Personal ambition. He wanted influence, or I say it this way, he wanted influence and or power. I don't know if he wanted both influence and power. I don't know if he just wanted power or just influence or a combination. I don't know what it was, but looking at just the events and stuff that took place around his life, he was a guy that wanted people to notice him. He was a guy that wanted to be in charge of things. He was a guy that wanted influence, or he wanted power over other people. And so the message of Christ was secondary to him because he wanted to fulfill his dreams and his influence and basically fulfill his self-esteem he needed through other people looking at him. The reason I say that is this. One of the things we know about Jesus' disciples, as Jesus went around talking about this kingdom he was going to establish, his disciples, because we saw this several weeks ago, I remember I told you a story about, I think it was James and John. They take their mother to Jesus, and they stand before him and go, hey, Jesus, can we, when everything goes down and you get your kingdom, can you put my boys on your right and left side of your throne? Can they sit in the seats of power? Do you remember that? And they actually have the gall to go to Jesus and go, can you put my boys in the seats of power? And it says the other 10 hear those two ask that, and they get ticked off. And they're like, how dare you guys take our seats? We want those seats. You see, the disciples were in a situation, they actually thought, because they hadn't figured it all out like we have hindsight, we can look back and go, oh, we know what the big picture is. They didn't. They kept hearing Jesus go, I'm establishing a kingdom, and they were going, we're going to get to sit in seats of prominence in that kingdom. We're going to have power. We're going to have influence. and we want the highest seats that we can get, the closest ones to Jesus. And so they have this mindset. And when that thing goes down with the 2 going and asking for that request and everyone gets ticked off, 11 of those guys, when Jesus rebuffs them and says, that's not how it works in my kingdom. It's the nobodies who will be the leaders someday, and it's the leaders who will be nobodies. And he goes, you need to become a servant if you want to be a leader in my kingdom. I think 11 of them heard that and went, I need to get myself in check. I think one of them, Judas, heard that and went, that's crazy. I need my seat. I want my influence. I want my power. What you see with Judas is this. At some point, he had worked his way into working with the money with the disciples. So somehow he had wormed himself in to being a treasure, so now he could feed his greed. And I think at the same time, he was trying to work himself into the leadership of Jesus' 12. You have Peter, James, and John, who seem to be the inner core 3. And I think Judas the whole time was trying to figure out a way to become one of those 3 or kick one out and him to get in that seat. And you see this personal ambition of his. You also see this, and this is where I think things changed on him. Jesus starts talking to them and starts telling them, I'm going to die. The Romans are going to crucify me. They're going to kill me, and I'm going to die. And I think Judas at that point, this is all speculation, this is just my opinion. I think Judas at that point when he heard that went, dude, if you die, if you're not the leader of this thing, someone else is going to have to be the leader of this thing, and I might as well be the one out front. And you see Judas at that point, it's not shortly after Jesus started talking about dying that Judas goes to the high priest, the ones who want to kill him. Judas didn't really know they wanted to kill him per se. They knew they wanted to get rid of him. But Judas goes and he cuts a deal and says, hey, I'm willing to sell him out to you if you just pay me some money. Feeds his greed. And they go, here's 30 things of silver. And he says, okay, I'll look for a time to betray him. We know in the garden, the night of his arrest, they go out and Judas shows up with the soldiers in the middle of the night. And Judas goes up and he's the one that kisses Jesus to go, this is the guy. And they go over and arrest him. What happens next after that, Judas finds out he's been sentenced to death, and that's where he has remorse. I think Judas thought they just want to get rid of him, so they're going to arrest him, and he's going to go and rot in a prison somewhere, or they're going to ship him off to some island, and he's going to be gone, and now I get to sit in the power seat, and I can run this organization. But what happens is he finds out Jesus is condemned to death, and he goes, his blood's going to be on my hands, and at that point he has remorse, and then he goes off and he hangs himself, okay? But his core reason for doing what he did, I think, was personal ambition. I want people to love me, or I want to be able to control people. And when you have that mindset as a follower of Christ, you will not grow. If you are looking to control people with power, if you are looking to have influence over people, and that's why you do the things you do, it is impossible for you to grow spiritually. It's impossible for you to enter into a close-knit relationship with Jesus Christ when it's all about you. Okay? Because in your relationship with Christ, it's all supposed to be about who? Him. And so those are the 3 key factors I see that destroy Judas, that end up making him a complete failure. But the good thing about Judas is this: he can teach us a very, very powerful lesson. And that is simply this: doubt, greed, and personal ambition will rob you of the life that God desires for you. Let me say that again. Doubt, greed, and personal ambition will rob you of the life God desires for you. They will become insurmountable barriers to your spiritual growth. They are things that will stop you from growing. And ultimately, they will leave you empty-handed with nothing to show for your life except regret and remorse, which is where Judas ends up. If you don't want to end up a failure in this life, there is only one guaranteed way to actually prevent that, and it's through a pursuit of spiritual growth, growing in your relationship with God. That pursuit will lead you to finding purpose, contentment, peace, and joy in this life. Next week, what we're going to look at is this. We're going to look at several examples of people who actually pursued spiritual growth and then found the rewards that actually come with it. And their lives are drastically changed, and they changed the world around them because they pursued spiritual growth. They don't end up failures like Judas. Would you pray with me? Heavenly Father,